In the margins of pre-statehood Louisiana, a theological seminary operated for nearly 150 years under shifting colonial and territorial administrations. Yet in 1888, all written traces of its activity ceased. No dissolution notice, no financial closure, no clergy reassignment. Historians and archivists alike have searched parish, federal, and diocesan records, but none have been able to locate a single document created by or mentioning the seminary after that year. What remained on the grounds was quietly auctioned off. Its former staff were untraceable. The St. Lorenzo Seminary of New Orleans was considered a regional anchor of spiritual education and clerical formation. Founded in 1742 by administrators under French colonial authority, it persisted through the Spanish period, the Louisiana Purchase, and Reconstruction. Publicly, it was known for its disciplined Latin curriculum and its strict policies on student conduct. By the mid-1800s, it had trained over 700 clerics who went on to serve in parishes across the South. Affiliated loosely with both civic and ecclesiastical bodies, the institution operated with limited oversight. Its faculty was seen but rarely named, and no alumni registry has survived. By the early 1750s, the St. Lorenzo Seminary occupied a rectangular parcel of land approximately 7 miles upriver, from the center of what would later become New Orleans proper. At the time, the seminary's position was strategic but understated. The property had been granted under French colonial authorization, documented in a concession ledger now held in the incomplete collections of the Louisiana Historical Survey. Its original deed was not filed in Paris, nor in the records of the Capuchin custodians, nominally responsible for spiritual oversight in the region. Instead, it was marked as a provisional educational license, designated for theological instruction and minor agricultural operations. From its earliest years, St. Lorenzo's isolation from urban governance allowed its internal structure to develop independently. The land included a low chapel, 2 timbered dormitories, and a third structure labeled variously in early ledgers as an instructional forum or communal lecture hall. No illustrations of these buildings exist from the era. A 1754 ordinance from the French Superior Council references the site as sufficiently removed from public distractions and designated for exclusive clerical development. The phrase was used repeatedly in subsequent decades whenever external authorities sought jurisdictional clarity over its function. Unlike other colonial institutions in Louisiana that shifted names, missions, or religious affiliations through the successive administrations of France, Spain, and the United States, St. Lorenzo's designations never formally changed. No charters were updated. No treaties redefined its ownership. Its original documents remained unmodified in all archival chains, an anomaly attributed to clerical duplication errors or gaps in record-keeping. But the consistency of the seminary's paper trail suggests a different pattern. A system designed to operate with minimal legal interaction, the seminary's population remained small. Between 1742 and 1789, the estimated number of residents never exceeded 25 individuals. Contemporary ecclesiastical institutions routinely surpassed 50 or 60. According to recovered logs from nearby parishes, St. Lorenzo consistently refused to enroll students younger than 16 or older than 23. Unlike diocesan schools, it did not admit the sons of planters or merchants unless the applicants arrived without named sponsorships. Only individuals listed as unencumbered by family interests were permitted to enroll. This policy was publicly framed as a rejection of nepotism, but it produced a student body unconnected to regional families or legacy networks. Daily operations were regulated through a series of internal memoranda, handwritten and unsigned, later copied into bound volumes whose authors remain unidentified. These volumes, now partially preserved in the Benedictine Records Annex in Baton Rouge, include inventories of lesson plans, prayer recitations, and schedules for silent periods. No formal grading systems were used. Completion of instruction was based on internal approval, given in the form of a single wax-sealed letter, delivered directly to a diocesan office selected by the faculty. No copies were retained. The faculty composition of St. Lorenzo was even more opaque. Officially, the seminary never employed more than 3 instructors at a time. Their identities were rarely disclosed publicly. Clergy assigned to Louisiana often reference the seminary only in abstract terms, describing it as a quiet school upriver or the lodge. Of the known faculty across its first century, only one individual appears in other church registers, a Spanish-born instructor named Javier Calvo, who taught at St. Lorenzo for 9 years before being reassigned in 1767. No exit records or cause of reassignment were recorded. His subsequent postings in Guatemala and later in Havana contain no reference to his years in Louisiana. Visitors to the seminary were uncommon. A 1793 travel journal, written by a surveyor attached to a French-Spanish commission, includes one of the only non-ecclesiastical descriptions of the site. The author notes, "A quiet and dry compound, with 4 low buildings set apart from each other," and remarks on the lack of visible activity despite hearing the striking of a wooden clapper at regular hours. The use of clappers instead of bells was unusual for the time, typically associated with monastic orders or secluded infirmaries. No further details are given in the journal. From 1803 onward, following the Louisiana Purchase, the seminary's legal standing should have shifted under United States territorial law, yet no records indicate any formal interaction between federal authorities and the institution. St. Lorenzo did not submit land claims, property tax filings, or charter renewals. In an 1810 land survey conducted by the Office of Public Lands, the area surrounding the seminary was labeled occupied, religious estate, status exempt. The exemption was neither challenged nor audited. It remained in place through the Civil War. In the public imagination, St. Lorenzo existed only in passing. During the mid-19th century, when new theological colleges were established in Baton Rouge, Mobile, and Charleston, St. Lorenzo's name appeared only once in comparative educational bulletins. That reference, published in 1841, described it as a primitive establishment with rigid pre-Republican customs, offering no formal degrees. The phrase pre-Republican was understood to imply a pedagogical structure out of step with modern systems, but not inherently obsolete. At no point did critics call for its reform or closure. Donations to the seminary followed a separate pathway. Parish records from the surrounding region show an irregular flow of small estate transfers, often from unmarried individuals with no heirs. These properties were usually rural and included modest acreages or isolated buildings. While most seminaries held land collectively under diocesan trusteeship, the properties linked to St. Lorenzo were acquired under independent titles. A number of them were held in the name of a clerical fiduciary who never resided at the seminary but whose signature appears on over 20 deeds between 1822 and 1876. No photograph or portrait of this individual exists. While most seminaries of the period celebrated public masses or held catechism events open to nearby communities, St. Lorenzo made no such offerings. Parish bulletins from New Orleans and Jefferson Parish consistently list events at all active religious institutions of the time, except St. Lorenzo. One rare mention in an 1852 bulletin referred to a visiting rector from upriver who declined to participate in public devotionals. The omission was never explained. Despite its seclusion, St. Lorenzo was not unknown among clerics. Letters between bishops in the mid-1800s make passing reference to the seminary as a source of independent ordinands who required no formal vetting. A missive from 1859 addressed to the Bishop of Natchez notes, "They arrive credentialed but unverifiable. From the seminary. We accept them nonetheless." The lack of scrutiny was partly justified by the institution's long-standing presence and presumed oversight from a senior religious order. However, no such supervising order is named in any surviving correspondence. The seminary's publications, if any existed, were never printed for external distribution. Unlike most religious schools of the time, St. Lorenzo did not produce a newsletter, a liturgical calendar, or any catechetical texts. The absence of a printing press or scriptorium was noted by an archivist in 1871 who attempted to inventory religious institutions west of the Mississippi. His report lists St. Lorenzo as existing but inaccessible, and remarks that no pamphlets, notices, or broadsides were recovered. The only known exception to this pattern is a ledger found in the cellar of a Jesuit residence in Pensacola. The ledger, undated but likely from the 1830s, contains references to 12 from the upriver school, marked and sealed. Feuilleton, what marked and sealed denotes is not explained, nor is the relevance of their origin clarified. The entry appears in a margin and is followed by several lines that have been deliberately scratched out with ink. The administrative silence surrounding St. Lorenzo became more apparent in the final decades of the 19th century, as diocesan authorities began implementing uniform tracking of clerical appointments and educational credentials across the southern region. These efforts were supported by the expansion of telegraph systems and improved transportation routes, which allowed for more frequent communication between diocesan centers. Most seminaries responded by submitting updated faculty rosters and ordination records. St. Lorenzo submitted nothing. An internal memo from the Archdiocese of New Orleans, dated February 1881, flagged the seminary for absence of contact. The note, composed by an administrative assistant, listed it among 5 institutions requiring documentation for a pending review of regional clerical compliance. The seminary was the only one of the 5 that had no file on record. Attempts to request information from the institution were marked inconclusive. No physical correspondence bearing the seminary's seal or letterhead has been recovered from this period. That same year, a diocesan auditor named Felix Aubert made an unscheduled visit to the site. His personal notebook, now held in a restricted file at the church's provincial archives, records several observations from the grounds. Aubert arrived on foot, having dismissed his driver at a nearby ferry landing. He reached the seminary near dusk and found the outer gate unsecured. The buildings appeared in reasonable condition, but showed minimal signs of occupation. No personnel identified themselves during his brief inspection. A meal had been prepared in what he assumed was the kitchen, but no serving staff were present. He noted lit lamps in the chapel, unaccompanied by any sound or motion. Aubert did not enter the dormitories. He departed after 2 hours and filed no formal report. Instead, the matter was temporarily closed. No follow-up investigation was scheduled. The institution remained listed in diocesan directories through 1887, without contact information or administrative links. It was one of only 2 such listings without faculty or location notes. Inquiries from clerical placement boards received no reply. In 1884, a land reassessment conducted by state officials included the parcel registered under St. Lorenzo's original colonial deed. The assessor's notes describe an enclosed academic property, lacking visible signage, with all 4 structures intact. Despite occupying a considerable portion of registered land, the site was assessed at a nominal value, citing limited access and undeclared use. The lack of documentation prevented tax enforcement. The report was filed but not acted upon. By 1886, correspondence from the Bishop of Galveston references the seminary in a tone of uncertainty. In a letter to the Bishop of Mobile, he wrote, "I cannot confirm their operation. No ordinances have arrived from that quarter in over 5 years. If they remain functional, they are silent." This silence had not previously raised concern, given the institution's long history of discretion. But the sudden absence of graduates or transfers marked a significant shift. Other seminaries had begun adjusting their programs to align with standard accreditation systems. St. Lorenzo did not participate. The following year, the Jesuit provincial administrator responsible for Louisiana issued a circular requesting clarification from all affiliated educational institutions. While St. Lorenzo had never formally belonged to the Jesuit order, it was still included in the list as a legacy participant in regional theological exchanges. No response was received. The circular's notes indicate that 1 letter was returned unopened, with no delivery receipt or forwarding address. In January 1888, a small parcel adjacent to the seminary's property was purchased by a shipping contractor named Martin Fraser. His intention was to use the land as a timber staging area for river barge operations. Fraser documented the transaction and requested a boundary confirmation from the parish recorder. During the process, He noted that none of the seminary's caretakers responded to inquiries about fencing, water access, or shared easements. A notary filed a formal request for acknowledgement of border limits. The request expired without reply. Shortly thereafter, all references to the seminary ceased. In March of that year, the final diocesan directory listing St. Lorenzo omitted its location, noting it only as institution unverified. Clerical bulletins for the surrounding parishes no longer mentioned any associated personnel. Property maps printed between 1889 and 1891 list the land as vacant, origin uncertain. The phrase appears across multiple municipal filings. During an administrative reorganization in 1892, the Archdiocese officially closed its file on St. Lorenzo. No press release was issued. No transfer of assets was recorded. In public records, the seminary simply disappeared from active status. The buildings remained standing for another decade, but were eventually sold at public auction. The sale was handled by a local fiduciary office under the direction of an estate consolidation firm. All sale documentation listed the former seminary as non-responsive property. The auction catalogue did not mention religious affiliation or educational history. Bidders were informed only of the square footage and material value. By 1903, the structures had been dismantled. The wood was repurposed for municipal storage buildings and riverboat docks. No plaque or historical marker was erected. A regional archivist who attempted to trace the seminary's furnishings encountered multiple dead ends. The chapel's altar, presumed to be of significant age, was never located. In 1911, a retired cleric named Léon Durand submitted a handwritten account to a historical society in Baton Rouge. He claimed to have studied at St. Lorenzo in the 1860s. His letter, which remains in an uncatalogued file, includes only general descriptions of the seminary's routine. He emphasized the quiet of the grounds and the absence of formal instruction schedules. According to Durand, everything moved without announcement. We were expected to know the times, though no bell rang. His recollections do not mention faculty by name. When asked for further details, he declined, stating that the habits of silence remain. By the mid-20th century, few references to St. Lorenzo appeared in educational or ecclesiastical literature. It was listed in two obscure indexes as a discontinued private seminary and unaffiliated theological site, 1742-1888. No footnotes were attached. Inquiries by researchers in the 1960s revealed little beyond property deeds and scattered ledger references. Most files retrieved during that period were incomplete, handwritten, and unsigned. No admission records, personal correspondence, or faculty registers have surfaced. Attempts to catalogue alumni produced inconclusive results. While several clergy from Louisiana, Mississippi, and eastern Texas were believed to have been trained at St. Lorenzo, their ordination documents did not specify the institution. Baptismal registers in the vicinity contain only 2 references to seminary instructors, without names. Census records list the property as unoccupied after 1889. No transfer of clerical personnel from the seminary to any other religious institution has been documented. In 1972, a historical preservationist working on colonial educational sites compiled a private dossier on St. Lorenzo. He noted the absence of architectural blueprints, photographs, or artistic renderings. The only known visual reference is a charcoal drawing attributed to a former instructor, found in a private collection in Lafayette. The drawing depicts a cluster of low windowless buildings surrounded by palmetto scrub. No human figures are visible. To this day, no institutional archive claims responsibility for St. Lorenzo. The seminary is not listed in the official histories of Louisiana's religious education system. It appears in no curated exhibits and holds no digital catalog entry in academic databases. Researchers who inquire are typically directed to local parish files, most of which contain only vague citations or unverified notes. The site itself is now overgrown. No foundation stones remain. A single boundary marker, made of cast iron, lies embedded in the underbrush near the river. It bears no inscription. Among the few references to St. Lorenzo that persisted into the early 20th century, none carried administrative authority. Scattered mentions appeared in estate appraisals, non-circulating diocesan memos, and clerical annotations. These traces, though fragmentary, suggest repeated attempts by various officials to account for the institution's operations in the years immediately preceding its disappearance. The tone of these documents, when read closely, reflects an increasing discomfort with the seminary's non-compliance, though formal action was never taken. One of the earliest indicators of this discomfort emerged in a provincial planning document from 1873, now stored in a state-bound ecclesiastical ledger at Tulane's Rare Collections Annex. The document, which catalogued all known clerical training sites in Louisiana and adjacent territories, included a margin note beside the entry for St. Lorenzo. No graduates registered since '68, no site visit confirmed, verification requested. The handwriting is uncertain, and no initials accompany the note. Nevertheless, the query remained unanswered through the following 3 editions. A more direct concern appeared in the correspondence of Bishop Ulysses Armand of Lafayette. In an 1879 letter to a regional education committee, he commented, "We are repeatedly asked about the status of the River Seminary. I can offer no present witness to its function. Requests for inspection have received no reply. It does not accept visitors, nor does it send anyone." Despite this, the bishop concluded his note by affirming that St. Lorenzo should remain listed as operational, citing its historical placement and long-standing exemption from diocesan interference. The term exemption was used ambiguously. No legal basis for exemption appears in Louisiana's territorial or state religious records. St. Lorenzo was never granted legal autonomy, yet it operated in ways consistent with institutions that had received such status. The likely explanation is that the seminary fell between administrative systems, first under colonial rule, then during post-annexation confusion. This vacuum of authority was rarely contested, perhaps due to the seminary's tendency to avoid drawing attention to itself. In the limited correspondence that did occur, one recurring issue was the status of ordination records. By the late 1860s, most seminaries were expected to document each candidate's progression and submit signed evaluations before ordination. These records were necessary to ensure clerical eligibility and to prevent duplication across dioceses. St. Lorenzo did not follow this protocol. A memo filed in 1874 by the Bishop of Vicksburg notes, "A man appeared bearing only a stamped notice from the River Seminary. It was unsigned, unsealed, yet recognized by the receiving parish. There is no prior documentation." The parish in question accepted the candidate without protest. Other inconsistencies surfaced in sacramental logs. An 1880 audit of baptismal registries from isolated parishes in Plaquemines Parish and St. Mary Parish revealed a number of officiants listed only by initials without parish affiliation. In 6 instances, the initials matched those of individuals rumored to have studied at St. Lorenzo. The officiants never returned for follow-up postings. Their names do not appear in any transfer or reassignment notices. It remains unclear how they received authorization to perform official functions, if at all. This pattern of minimal documentation became more visible as diocesan record-keeping improved. In a post-1870 environment marked by increased standardization, St. Lorenzo's irregularities became more difficult to ignore. Yet the institutional response was passive. While other seminaries submitted annual updates, St. Lorenzo remained a blank entry in nearly every administrative category. No headmaster, no term dates, no student population. In lieu of data, clerical directories printed the phrase "information not submitted," which appeared unchanged in 5 consecutive years. An unfiled draft of a diocesan internal audit from 1882 included a handwritten addendum. There is something intentionally silent about the seminary. Either they have retreated from external affairs, or they no longer exist in form. The sentence was later crossed out, possibly by a supervising editor. The audit was published without mention of St. Lorenzo. In response to these omissions, several minor investigations were undertaken, though none proceeded beyond surface inquiries. A clerk from the New Orleans Curia office, Simon Leclerc, submitted a proposal in 1885 to conduct a site visit with the goal of securing instructional logs or faculty records. His request was filed and approved. However, Leclerc later withdrew, citing insufficient logistical support. No substitute was named. An annotation beside his request states simply, "Travel deferred indefinitely." In the following year, a civil initiative from the State Board of Land Management prompted an inventory of educational properties held under pre-Republican titles. The process involved requesting site maps, deed copies, and statements of function. According to meeting minutes from June 1886, St. Lorenzo was among 12 properties that failed to provide any reply. The board noted that the land had not been reassessed in more than 25 years and lacked any official improvements since the original structures were razed. This apparent dormancy did not go unnoticed by neighboring residents. In an 1887 letter to a land surveyor, a property owner identified only as C. Duvois remarked that the school is not visited nor seen to receive supplies. It neither emits sound nor receives light after dark. The context of the letter involved a boundary dispute, but the observation was appended voluntarily. No other written complaints about the seminary's activity levels have been located. Meanwhile, the seminary continued to appear in financial summaries despite producing no recorded output. It was cited in the 1886 Diocesan Expenditure Review as a historically exempt institution requiring no subsidy. The phrase suggests that while the seminary held no budgetary influence, it remained recognized. Its ongoing presence in official publications further cemented its ambiguous status, active in title but invisible in function. Among clerical students in the region, St. Lorenzo had developed a reputation for being a non-option. Interviews conducted decades later with priests educated in the Gulf states reflect only vague awareness of the site. A 1915 oral account archived in the Opelousas Diocesan Center records a respondent saying, "We knew of it, but it was considered finished. One didn't go there, it was a name only." Other respondents echoed the sentiment, referring to St. Lorenzo as a place where one heard nothing and received less. Despite these sentiments, there were still occasional references to contact. A 1887 seminary bulletin from Mobile lists a guest speaker from upriver, formerly of St. Lorenzo. No name is attached. The speaker's topic was described as liturgical discipline in pre-modern settings. No transcript of the address survives, and the speaker does not appear in any other event records. That same year, a file from the provincial office in Baton Rouge noted a discrepancy in reported faculty for the region. 3 instructors were listed as active on a chart labeled Regional Theological Educators, yet their institutional affiliation was blank. The initials correspond with a ledger entry from St. Lorenzo dated 20 years prior. The source of this information remains unknown, as the original chart contains no citation. These anomalies accumulated without resolution. The regional authorities opted not to investigate further. Their decisions, consistent with a wider administrative pattern of deferral, allowed the seminary to maintain a state of silent persistence. By the time of its final removal from official directories in 1888, there was no formal recognition that the institution had ended operations. It had merely ceased to respond, and no action was taken to determine why. By the early 1880s, a few archivists and clerical officers had begun attempting to reconcile the presence of St. Lorenzo with emerging archival standards. One such effort, initiated in 1883 by a junior records examiner named Howard Vallette, sought to catalogue educational institutions that had existed during the pre-territorial period, but were still listed in diocesan inventories. His project, conducted under the Louisiana Historical Commission, resulted in a 12-page report that dedicated only 2 paragraphs to St. Lorenzo. In both, the language shifted from neutral enumeration to qualified speculation. Vallette wrote, "The institution maintains a theoretical presence in our registers, but resists confirmation. No public correspondence has emerged. No first-hand witness has stepped forward in the past 25 years. I suspect we are dealing not with dereliction, but with a design of obsolescence not declared." His language was later struck through in the master draft, and the final report listed the seminary simply as status undetermined, awaiting clerical verification. No such verification was ever issued. Additional signs of institutional closure, while subtle, emerged in records of supply distribution. Throughout the 1860s and 1870s, religious seminaries and boarding institutions regularly received standardized shipments of sacramental items, liturgical cloth, and devotional texts. These were recorded in shipping logs maintained by diocesan warehouses. St. Lorenzo appears in two such logs from 1864 and 1867, receiving crates of Latin language catechisms and altar linens. After that, no further deliveries are documented. A ledger entry from 1872 includes a question mark beside the seminary's name and a handwritten note stating "hold until confirmed," which is not followed by any clarification. The shipment remained undelivered. This cessation of supply was mirrored in the absence of correspondence. Clerical mail routes established in the mid-19th century required educational institutions to acknowledge receipt of circulars, regulatory updates, or calendar adjustments. While most seminaries returned signed notices within 2 weeks, St. Lorenzo was among the few that failed to do so across 3 consecutive mailing cycles. In each case, no response was recorded, and the undelivered notices were marked held or redirected. The postal entries contain no recipient initials. In parallel, civil officials responsible for surveying non-commercial properties in Orleans Parish noted inconsistencies in jurisdictional filings. During a review of educational institutions operating within unincorporated zones, the St. Lorenzo property lacked any affidavit of compliance with the state's revised education oversight statutes enacted in 1879. Most religious institutions had submitted their filings by 1881. The seminary was neither exempted nor penalized. Its absence from all compliance rosters was described in an internal municipal report as unexplained but long-standing. Further confusion arose in cartographic representations. A military map, drawn in 1885 by engineers preparing a contingency flood assessment along the Mississippi, includes a blank rectangle labeled "Seminary, undocumented." The shape of the structure had not been measured, and no surveyor had entered the grounds. According to notes attached to the map, the land had been observed only from the river, using long-range instruments. The report mentions no movement detected, and structural integrity appears unchanged. These observations were not considered relevant to the flood analysis and were left unpursued. The final known inquiry from a religious authority came in mid-1887, when a subcommittee on clerical credentials sought to verify ordination origins for several itinerant preachers active in rural parishes. Among the submitted files were 3 candidates whose supporting documents listed St. Lorenzo as their place of formation. None of the documents were signed. All 3 bore the same format: a date, the seminary's name, and a single line reading "prepared and acknowledged." No issuing faculty were named. The documents were accepted but flagged. No follow-up correspondence was made. Notably, this lack of identification did not prompt disqualification. The acceptance of such sparse documentation indicates that institutional name recognition, even in the absence of activity, carried considerable weight. St. Lorenzo's reputation as a long-established site, however inactive, was sufficient to satisfy minimum credentialing requirements. This policy was quietly reversed in early 1888, when new procedures required personal endorsements from active instructors. By that point, the seminary had not submitted any personnel lists for more than a decade. In the civic realm, similar patterns of avoidance continued. A real estate brokerage based in Carrollton submitted an application in late 1887 to assess adjacent parcels near the St. Lorenzo tract. The purpose was to determine whether nearby undeveloped land could be subdivided and sold. During this process, the firm's legal agent contacted the local assessor to verify the boundaries of the seminary. No owner of record could be located. The property file still listed the original colonial allotment, but contained no updates, signatures, or correspondence beyond the year 1849. The assessor marked the file as untouchable pending title clarification. The brokerage withdrew its application. The absence of claimants, legal representatives, or staff members was never publicly addressed. The grounds, according to anecdotal notes from nearby property owners, remained fenced and gated. One letter from March 1888, sent by a merchant conducting trade on the river route, described the seminary as standing, well-roofed, apparently maintained. He did not report activity, only that the exterior showed no damage and that the path leading from the dock to the main entrance had been recently cleared of debris. During the same month, a short article appeared in a French-language circular printed in Lafayette. The article, titled Les Écoles Mortes, briefly mentioned St. Lorenzo alongside two other institutions that had reportedly closed in prior decades. The entry stated, "This house once instructed men who went quietly into their stations, never writing back." No ceremony marked its end. The piece was unsigned and not attributed to any source. The circular ceased publication later that year. At the diocesan level, the final clerical reference to the seminary came in the form of a footnote attached to a transfer announcement in April 1888. A young instructor was being relocated from Baton Rouge to a teaching position in Mississippi. The footnote read, "Though considered, the former seminary at St. Lorenzo was determined to be unsuitable due to absence of functioning oversight." This notation marked the first and only recorded instance of an official determination about the seminary's operational viability. No document explaining the process or authority behind that conclusion was found. 3 months later, the seminary was removed from all regional directories. It did not appear in landholding indexes, seminary registries, or faculty rosters. Its former land tract was reclassified as non-affiliated religious parcel, status void. No sale announcement followed. The buildings were still visible on survey maps as late as 1890, but with no designations. By 1893, no persons associated with St. Lorenzo were listed as active in any religious capacity in Louisiana, Texas, Alabama, or Mississippi. A genealogical index compiled in 1896 included a column for former educators. Under the name St. Lorenzo, the entry read, "None traceable." This absence remained uncorrected through subsequent editions. An unpublished manuscript found among the private papers of historian Wallace Dureau contains a partial interview with a former cartographer who had surveyed the Mississippi corridor during the 1880s. The cartographer described seeing the seminary from a river skiff and remarked, "It was the kind of place you didn't approach. It had nothing to offer, and it asked for nothing." When asked if he had ever been invited to enter, he responded, "There was no one to invite you." The seminary's records, if they existed, were never recovered. Institutions tasked with historical preservation conducted limited searches in the early 20th century, but found no catalogued files, no inventories, and no retention logs. Former students, if living, remained unidentified. The grounds were eventually absorbed into unmarked territory, and no further reference was made to the institution in formal diocesan or state communication. In the years following St. Lorenzo's removal from institutional directories, occasional efforts were made to reassemble its historical footprint. These attempts rarely moved beyond marginal research projects and were frequently abandoned due to insufficient primary material. Yet among a small group of independent researchers in the 1920s and 1930s, questions began to circulate about the nature of the seminary's disappearance, and specifically, why no central archive had been created during its long period of operation. One such researcher, Miriam Estelle, an archivist attached to the Louisiana Episcopal Records Bureau, compiled a detailed outline of known references to St. Lorenzo. Her objective was to chart institutional growth and decline across non-affiliated theological sites during the colonial and early federal periods. She encountered difficulty when reviewing the seminary's property transactions, noting in her log that the holdings were cumulative but never co-registered. Parcels were acquired in irregular succession with no visible administrative consolidation. Estelle discovered that most of the real estate connected to the seminary had been acquired under temporary custodial arrangements, typically involving deceased individuals with no recorded heirs. This pattern of acquisition, uncommon among educational institutions, pointed to a form of property management designed to avoid scrutiny. Estates were frequently donated via unsigned declarations of religious intention, filed without witnesses and lacking formal transfer language. The documents often referred to perpetual academic use, a term not legally defined in Louisiana real estate law. In most cases, these parcels were left untouched, maintained only as undeveloped land. Estelle concluded that no operational agricultural or revenue-generating use could be confirmed. The absence of structural documentation extended to architectural plans. Building permits were not required before 1900, but public notices for institutional construction were common practice. No such notices were filed for St. Lorenzo. The earliest confirmed structure on the seminary grounds, described in a 1754 French inspection ledger, included a chapel of undetermined dimension and 2 adjacent quarters. The inspection log states only that the building stood with roofs intact and walls upright, with no signs of external labor. Later references to the structures never provide measurements, materials, or renovation dates. A 1798 letter from a missionary assigned briefly to the region describes the compound as consistently plain, free of ornament or designation. This lack of decorative or identifying markers may have contributed to the seminary's ability to avoid formal classification. Without visible insignia, engraved plaques, or public-facing signage, the site could not be catalogued under any religious order or civil authority. Maps drawn as late as the 1880s still depicted the property as a cluster of 4 indistinct rectangles. No cross, tower, or ecclesiastical emblem appears in any illustration or survey. The question of staff identity remained unresolved. A recurring element in archival correspondence from the 1850s through the 1880s is the complete omission of names when referring to St. Lorenzo personnel. Memos from bishops, instructors, and clerical assessors consistently describe the seminary in passive terms, never attributing statements or decisions to individuals. For example, in an 1877 letter from a diocesan officer tasked with updating seminarian placement charts, the sentence reads, "As for St. Lorenzo, no names were provided and no signature was offered. The enclosed reply bore only the institutional seal." That seal, referenced in a later note, was a simple circle, enclosing the word formatus. No date, motto, or issuing authority accompanied it. Further investigation into the seal's design yielded little. Heraldic specialists consulted in the 1930s identified no match in any major Catholic, Jesuit, or Benedictine archives. The term itself, a Latin past participle meaning having been formed, provided no immediate context. Its use without grammatical complement left its function ambiguous. Scholars speculated that it was either a symbolic gesture or a deliberately incomplete phrase. The most substantial attempt to understand the seminary's administrative model came from a short study written in 1936 by Dr. Kenneth Girard, a historian at a small college in northern Mississippi. In a monograph titled Marginal Ecclesiastical Entities of the Lower Mississippi, Girard devoted 1 chapter to St. Lorenzo. He proposed that the seminary operated on a system of silent credentials, wherein educational instruction and ordination authority were conferred through undocumented recognition rather than formalized process. He wrote, "St. Lorenzo presents no hierarchy, no faculty, and no evident paper trail. What remains is a shape without volume, a presence affirmed only by absence." Girard's theory drew limited academic attention, but attracted private correspondence. Among the letters he received was one from a retired parish registrar in Jackson who claimed to have processed marriage certificates during the 1870s, signed by officiants bearing names traced back to no institution but listed as qualified by virtue of oral confirmation. When pressed for further details, the registrar declined to provide examples, stating that the records had since been reassigned to a state microfilm project and no longer accessible. The subject of oral confirmation recurred in other contexts. A former instructor from a now-defunct seminary in Arkansas recalled a visit in the early 1880s from a candidate claiming to be a graduate of St. Lorenzo. The instructor, interviewed for a 1942 diocesan oral history project, remembered that the man brought no documents but recited a set of theological responses that matched no known catechism. He answered every question correctly, the instructor said, but not in the way we were taught. His replies had precision but no citation. The candidate was not admitted, but the instructor noted that he carried himself as if no further evaluation were needed. Such reports contribute to a larger picture of an institution that functioned apart from conventional systems, yet continued to produce individuals who were accepted into clerical roles. This contradiction between invisibility and recognition remains the central puzzle. The seminary was neither wholly isolated nor fully integrated. It existed within known boundaries, but without confirmed presence. Officials acknowledged its outputs, yet no one could confirm its inputs. Archival investigators revisiting the matter in the 1950s explored the possibility of external oversight. The theory posited that St. Lorenzo might have operated as a regional subsidiary of an unnamed foreign religious network. However, no foreign archives consulted during this period contained references to an American satellite seminary under that name or with matching coordinates. Letters sent to clerical historians in Spain, France, and Italy yielded no confirmed associations. The consensus returned to the same conclusion. St. Lorenzo was native to Louisiana and operated without external affiliation. By the time of the seminary's final administrative mention in 1888, the institution had already diverged from observable norms. It maintained no payroll, received no grants, and participated in no conferences. Its only known point of contact with the outside world came through the sporadic appearance of individuals who identified it as their place of education, yet lacked proof of enrollment or instruction. No student ever submitted a testimonial. No instructor ever issued a signed transcript. One remaining trace, discovered in 1954, was a ledger fragment found in the collection of a private religious society in Shreveport. The fragment, titled Admission Notes Partial, listed a dozen first names followed by dates ranging from 1831 to 1876. No surnames were included. At the bottom of the page, a line written in a different hand reads, "Confirmed by review, returned without adjustment." Scholars have debated whether the page originated from St. Lorenzo or was misfiled from another institution. No match has been found in known seminary records. The ledger fragment has since been stored in a sealed archival drawer, labeled Unverified Document, Origin Unknown. It remains one of the only physical objects ever attributed, even tentatively, to the seminary's operational life. The possibility that St. Lorenzo Seminary deliberately operated outside archival norms remained a subject of occasional inquiry among ecclesiastical record keepers well into the mid-20th century. Among the limited group of researchers still interested in the case during the 1960s, attention shifted toward anecdotal sources and interviews with descendants of regional clergy in an effort to trace any indirect memory of the institution's practices. These efforts, while methodologically limited, revealed certain patterns that suggested institutional habits had been passed down informally, even as formal records remained absent. One such interview, conducted in 1963 by a church historian affiliated with a small Jesuit college in Tennessee, included the testimony of a woman who claimed her uncle had attended a quiet school upriver sometime before the Civil War. According to her statement, he never referred to it by name, but often remarked that it had no classroom, no instruction in the usual way. She recounted that when asked about his religious studies, he would say, "We were taught to remember, not to recite." No documents from her family confirmed his attendance, though a photograph from the late 1870s shows him in clerical dress, bearing insignia not associated with any known order. Such anomalies extended to material artifacts. In 1968, a curator at a diocesan museum in Baton Rouge reported acquiring a small wooden writing desk with a faint carving on its underside, reading SL 1842. The desk had been salvaged from a decommissioned presbytery. Its provenance was traced only to a parish near Plaquemines. The seminary's initials, while not definitive, were considered by the curator to be a likely reference. The artifact contained no hidden compartments or identifying features beyond the carved initials, and no written materials were found within it. The desk remains on display in a side gallery, labeled simply as unattributed ecclesiastical furniture. In the early 1970s, another researcher, Paula Thibodeau, began cataloging Louisiana's lost religious institutions for a state-funded preservation project. While reviewing property files from Jefferson Parish, she discovered a brief reference to a parcel described in 1858 as restricted religious instructional in nature, not open to public inspection. The parcel's coordinates aligned with known descriptions of the St. Lorenzo site. Thibodeau attempted to retrieve the accompanying inspection report, but it had been permanently withdrawn in 1919 due to irregularities in boundary data. No copies remained. In her notes she wrote, "The omission does not appear accidental. The surrounding properties are intact, but this one is hollowed out, present in outline, absent in detail." She further noted that the property had been assessed 5 times between 1860 and 1902, each time resulting in incomplete entries or annotations citing pending verification from ecclesiastical authority. The name of the responsible authority was never given. By the 5th entry, the assessor simply marked the property as inactive, not reassigned. An inquiry made to the regional assessor's office in 1974 confirmed that the parcel had never been formally repossessed or transferred. It remained technically listed under its original designation, even though the title itself was no longer legally recognized. When asked why it had not been removed from public registry, a clerk responded that no such action had been requested. According to state procedure, only an official transfer or voluntary forfeiture could initiate removal. Neither had occurred. These legal ambiguities fed into a broader pattern, that of a property, an institution, and a function maintained without visible maintenance. No student lists, teaching schedules, or facility blueprints had ever been submitted. Yet the seminary's existence was continuously acknowledged through minor citations, passing mentions, and logistical notations. It was never pronounced closed, only uncontacted. In a separate effort, researchers in the 1980s reviewed private donations made to diocesan archives between 1900 and 1950. Among them was a sealed envelope marked "Personal Do Not Catalogue," found in a box of unrelated clerical correspondence. Inside the envelope was a folded page bearing 2 short handwritten entries. The first read, "He arrived without credentials, claimed instruction from upriver and asked no stipend." The second, in a different hand, stated, "No record necessary. Verified through result." Neither line was signed, and no date was given. The envelope was filed away once more and remains in restricted storage. This practice of verification through result appeared in at least 3 additional archived references. In each case, the phrase was used to justify the acceptance of a cleric or instructor whose background could not be confirmed, but whose conduct was deemed sufficient. The decision to accept these individuals appears to have been made locally and without higher review. Such acceptance implicitly validated the seminary's function, even if it did not clarify its methods. The surrounding parishes, despite their administrative distance, occasionally made indirect observations. A weather journal maintained by a lay minister in St. Charles Parish includes a note from August 1886 stating, "Passed by the compound today. No smoke, no movement. Same as last year." The comment is brief, placed between entries about rainfall and crop progress. It reflects no surprise or concern, only continuity. No event marked the seminary's final silence. It was not dissolved by decree, sold by authority, or overtaken by development. Its absence from public use appears to have occurred gradually, through a long pattern of non-response, omission, and deferred recognition. Officials requested verification and received none. Researchers sought confirmation and found only suggestion. Even property boundaries, once clearly marked, faded from attention without being erased. In the few institutional summaries that mention St. Lorenzo in the modern era, the language is uniformly reserved. A 1994 compendium of Louisiana theological history includes the sentence, "St. Lorenzo Seminary, known to have operated between 1742 and 1888, not documented thereafter." Nature of closure unrecorded. No speculation is offered. The reference stands as an acknowledgement without explanation. Among local historians, the subject occasionally arises in forums, but no additional information has been introduced since the mid-20th century. The location of the grounds, while technically identified in historical maps, remains overgrown and is not maintained. Attempts to mark the site have failed due to unresolved ownership status and the absence of verifiable institutional successors. Nothing prevents investigation, yet no further efforts have been made. In the decades after St. Lorenzo Seminary disappeared from all registries, a quiet indifference set in among the institutions that had once acknowledged its presence. This indifference did not stem from negligence, but from the absence of anything actionable. Without documentation, claimants, or disputes, the seminary left behind no administrative burden. As a result, its story was not erased so much as bypassed, folded into a category of unresolved historical residue that neither obstructed nor contributed to institutional memory. By the 1920s, the land once held under the seminary's name was referenced only in land tax reports as an inactive tract, with no recorded improvements. A brief attempt to lease part of the property to a sugarcane consortium in 1926 failed due to lack of ownership verification. The company withdrew after 2 months and no formal lease agreement was ever recorded. Photographs taken by a field appraiser show tree growth overtaking the former access path and remnants of wooden fencing, unpainted and in disrepair. The structures themselves were gone. In academic settings, the seminary's history was rarely addressed directly. Only 2 doctoral dissertations published before 1950 included even passing references to the institution, both as examples of early colonial-era educational outposts. Neither paper attempted to reconcile the inconsistency between the seminary's recorded longevity and its lack of institutional footprint. Instead, the authors categorized it among early experiments in clerical training that failed to transition into the modern administrative era. The reluctance to engage with St. Lorenzo in scholarly contexts may have stemmed from the absence of interpretive anchors. With no personal letters, faculty biographies, or curriculum descriptions, researchers lacked the basic elements required to construct a narrative. Unlike defunct institutions that left behind libraries, building plans, or alumni networks, St. Lorenzo offered nothing beyond registry entries and property maps. Even these were indirect, with most references relying on third-party observations. Within regional archives, the seminary was often used as an example of null provenance in training modules for new catalogers. In these exercises, it served as a demonstration of how to log entries for historical entities that lack definitive sources. One such manual, printed by the Louisiana Records Consortium in 1958, includes the instruction, "When encountering institutions such as St. Lorenzo Seminary, limit descriptions to confirmed external mentions. Do not attempt reconstruction or infer motive. Document only what is evident." The passage illustrates the shift from inquiry to containment, marking a turning point in the seminary's archival treatment. By the 1970s, the subject had migrated into folklore. Several local heritage groups compiled oral history anthologies that included brief recollections of the school by the river. In these accounts, the seminary was portrayed less as an institution and more as a landmark of uncertain relevance. One entry, recorded in Pointe Coupée Parish, described a place where men once studied without being seen and left with no need to explain. Another, recounted by a long-retired mail carrier, mentioned delivering sealed envelopes to the edge of the property, placing them on a stone post near the entrance and never receiving confirmation of receipt. No folklore surrounding St. Lorenzo ever suggested controversy. There were no stories of disciplinary issues, doctrinal disputes, or community interference. What emerged instead was a pattern of detachment. Even in recollection, the seminary was described as something set apart, not by policy or geography, but by orientation. People spoke of it in spatial terms, faced inward, turned away, built not to address. These descriptions, while imprecise, captured the seminary's position within the social and religious landscape of its time. It was present, acknowledged, but not engaged. Institutionally, its disappearance created no administrative deficit. The functions it once performed were either assumed by other seminaries or rendered obsolete by new ordination protocols. There was no backlog of incomplete training, no reassignment of faculty, and no need for document retrieval. The seminary's absence had no measurable impact on clerical staffing or educational capacity in the region. Efforts to memorialize the site were brief and unsuccessful. In 1983, a proposal to include St. Lorenzo on a state registry of historic religious institutions was submitted to the Louisiana Office of Cultural Development. The application was denied on the basis that the institution left behind no verifiable physical or textual record. A review committee concluded that, while the site is of theoretical interest, it fails to meet the criteria for historical designation due to lack of interpretive material and the absence of corroborated structural evidence. The parcel remained unmarked. The seminary's absence from commemorative initiatives extended to church publications. During the Louisiana Diocesan Bicentennial celebrations held in the late 1980s, brochures listing former seminaries did not include St. Lorenzo. A marginal note in a planning memo acknowledged the omission, citing uncertain details and no available imagery. The organizers opted to focus on institutions with recoverable data and visual archives, both of which St. Lorenzo lacked. In 1991, a documentary series on early Southern religious institutions included a 10-second mention of the seminary. Narration over a slow aerial shot of forested land stated, "Among the many now forgotten sites is St. Lorenzo Seminary, a school that once trained clerics in near total silence, leaving no records and no artifacts." No further information was presented. The segment ended with the phrase, "Its purpose remains uncertain." One final attempt to catalogue the institution came in 2004, when a national archival project surveyed lost seminaries for potential digitization. Volunteers reviewed dozens of sites across Louisiana and Mississippi. Their report listed St. Lorenzo under Entry Unverified, Insufficient Metadata. No further updates were made. Among local parishes, references to the seminary have ceased. Clergy educated in the 21st century report no awareness of its existence unless prompted by researchers. Its name no longer appears in homilies, anniversary retrospectives, or regional newsletters. Parishioners asked about the seminary often respond with confusion or conflate it with unrelated institutions. The grounds, now under unmanaged conservation status, contain no structures or accessible paths. Surveyors from the State Geospatial Department conducted a drone assessment in 2017, which identified rectangular ground disturbances consistent with historical foundations. No excavation was authorized. The site remains closed to public visitation, with no scheduled plans for development or historical inquiry. The final disposition of the St. Lorenzo site was not the result of a legal action, sale, or reclamation. Rather, it was an outcome of attrition. As regional land boundaries were redrawn through the late 20th century to accommodate flood control zones and utility easements, the seminary parcel was subsumed under an area labeled Undeveloped Public Interest Buffer. This designation, established by municipal planning offices in 1989, effectively removed it from consideration for zoning or sale. The entry carried no historical annotation. By that time, the seminary's absence had become a fixed feature in regional planning documents. It was not considered an oversight or anomaly. The blank area on maps, once questioned, was accepted as part of the administrative landscape. Requests to clarify its designation met with stock responses. No record available, not assigned, or outside current jurisdiction. The language reflected neither concern nor curiosity, only procedural finality. In 2008, a civic restoration group dedicated to identifying former religious properties initiated a search for unmarked theological sites between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Volunteers reviewed plats, collected oral histories, and cross-referenced known diocesan expansions. St. Lorenzo was listed in their internal notes, but was not included in the public report. The project lead cited a lack of physical evidence and no community memory associated with the location. When asked during a regional preservation symposium about the decision, he replied, "We didn't find anything that pointed to what it ever was, or who it belonged to. The name alone wasn't enough." One of the last mentions of the seminary in any official context occurred in 2012. when an intern at the State Office of Records flagged an outdated land parcel for potential delisting. The intern included a comment in the recommendation form. This site may have hosted a religious institution known as St. Lorenzo Seminary. No supporting documents located. No known parties of interest. The delisting proceeded without revision. The parcel's designation was changed to non-associative legacy land. Though the seminary had been removed from functional maps, its former location continued to appear on certain archival overlays used by university researchers. In these datasets, the parcel is represented by an unlinked identifier with no corresponding institution. Users clicking on the site receive a message reading "No data available." Metadata includes only the approximate date range 1742 to 1888 and a source label referencing an outdated regional clergy directory. Despite its disappearance from official frameworks, the name St. Lorenzo still circulates in certain informal networks. Online forums dedicated to historical anomalies occasionally list it among unexplained institutions, alongside defunct coastal forts and early river settlements with incomplete records. Discussions focus less on the seminary's function and more on the impossibility of its verification. Contributors share scanned images of documents, excerpts from journals, and links to archived surveys, but none of the materials confirm the institution's origin or end. In the rare academic mentions that still occur, St. Lorenzo is framed not as a failed school or mismanaged estate, but as a structural absence. The 2016 lecture at a conference on historical documentation described it as a sustained non-compliance with recordable form. The speaker, a senior archivist from a northeastern university, concluded his talk by saying, "St. Lorenzo was not forgotten. It was unrecorded by choice or design and thus exists only where nothing was done about it." This characterization has gained modest traction among scholars focused on institutional silences. A published article in 2019 argued that the seminary's presence, noted only by its effects and citations by others, functioned as an example of passive continuity. The author wrote, "It occupied a role in systems that tolerated its silence. It needed no archives, because no one required them. Its function persisted without reinforcement." The article drew comparisons to similar cases in other regions, but none matched St. Lorenzo's duration or lack of interruption. Among the few physical remnants attributed to the seminary, only 2 items remain in public collections. The first is the desk housed at the Baton Rouge Museum, still on display without formal attribution. The second is a bound volume of administrative abstracts, held at a diocesan facility and not available for general access. The volume includes several second-hand references to St. Lorenzo, but no documents originating from the seminary itself. Its inclusion in the archive is incidental, and staff acknowledge that its presence offers no clarity on the institution's operations. Occasionally, efforts are made to reopen the subject through independent research or postgraduate inquiry. These projects rarely progress beyond literature reviews. The difficulty lies not in lack of interest, but in the absence of procedural entry points. With no personnel lists, property deeds, or theological statements, researchers have no context for exploration. Even the few names associated with the seminary are uncertain, known only through peripheral annotations or passing mentions in unrelated correspondence. As a result, St. Lorenzo remains an outlier. It is not a cautionary tale of institutional failure, nor an example of early innovation lost to time. It is instead a record of uninterrupted omission. The seminary did not conclude with scandal, decree, or dissolution. It did not collapse. It was not destroyed. It did not relocate or rebrand. Its function, whatever it may have been, ended without declaration. Today, those seeking to mark the site encounter an absence of precedent. Without evidence, interpretation becomes inadvisable. Without structure, commemoration becomes speculative. The only gesture made toward recognition came in 2021, when a local historical group proposed a general marker to acknowledge unregistered religious activity known to have occurred in the area prior to 1900. The proposal was rejected for lack of specific attribution. The marker was never cast. The tract of land remains undisturbed. Occasional visitors pass through, unaware of its past designations. Botanists studying regional flora have noted unusual consistency in vegetation patterns across the parcel, with older tree lines uninterrupted by clearing or grading. Soil records show no trace of building foundations or utility disruption. The land behaves as if it was never modified. In digital archives, the seminary's metadata grows thinner with each transfer to newer systems. Categories labeled unknown, unverified, or not applicable replace prior footnotes and bibliographies. The formatting favors omission over annotation. Eventually, the system ceases to generate queries for the entry at all. What remains is the absence, not actively sustained but not erased, preserved in stillness, unchanged by attention. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way, we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story was taken from documents that were found. All names have been edited to protect the source.